They accused her of wearing a uniform she hadn't earned, told her to remove it immediately. She didn't argue. She just unzipped the jacket and slowly rolled up her sleeve, and the entire room froze. Because ink doesn't lie. A scorched tattoo, dagger through a torn flag, with the number D-17 below. A mark only 2 soldiers had ever worn. One died in 2018, and the other just stood there. Her name was Tessa Morin, 41 years old, small in stature, with black hair pulled back in a tight bun. Sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, but said nothing. She worked quietly in the logistics department, medical inventory, equipment distribution, the kind of work that keeps a base running, but nobody notices. Nobody knew her background. She didn't wear rank insignia, didn't wear a name tag, just a faded military surplus jacket, old, worn, with no unit patches or identifiers. For 3 years, she'd been part of the background. The woman who restocked the medical supplies, who organized the equipment requests, who showed up early and left late without saying a word to anyone. Most people assumed she was a civilian contractor, maybe former military, maybe just someone who liked military surplus clothing. On a Saturday morning, the base was hosting a joint civilian-military training exercise. Community outreach. Local law enforcement working alongside active duty personnel. Tessa had volunteered for temporary logistics support. Nothing unusual. She did it every month. But this time, someone noticed her jacket. Lieutenant Mark Stevens was 24 years old, fresh out of officer training, the kind of soldier who followed regulations to the letter and expected everyone else to do the same. He pointed at Tessa as she carried a supply crate across the training area. "Excuse me, that's not regulation uniform. You're not authorized to wear that." Sergeant First Class Rodriguez laughed. "Where'd you buy that thing?" "Military surplus store?" Stevens stepped closer, his voice getting louder. "Ma'am, that jacket is military property. If you're not enlisted, you cannot wear it." A small crowd was gathering. Other soldiers, some civilians, all watching this confrontation unfold. Staff Sergeant Williams joined in. "We need to see some ID. This could be stolen valor." The accusations kept coming, each one louder than the last. Each one more certain that they'd caught someone pretending to be something they weren't. Tessa stood perfectly still. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't try to explain. She just listened. Her face showed no emotion, no anger, no embarrassment, just patience. Like she'd been through this before. Lieutenant Stevens raised his voice. "Remove the jacket. This is a direct order. We need to log your identification and file a written report." The crowd pressed closer. Phones were coming out. This was about to become a viral moment for all the wrong reasons. Tessa set down the supply crate she'd been carrying. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the zipper of her jacket. CTA Act 1. Comment. Silence isn't guilt. Sometimes it's respect. Master Sergeant Jackson, the logistics coordinator, pushed through the crowd. "What's the problem here?" Stevens turned to him. "Sir, this civilian is wearing unauthorized military clothing. We're conducting an investigation." Jackson looked at Tessa. He'd worked with her for 3 years. Never had a problem. Never asked questions about her background. "Ma'am," he said formally, "if you're not currently enlisted, military regulations prohibit wearing that uniform. I'm going to need to see some identification." Tessa nodded once. Slowly, she unzipped the faded jacket and let it fall to the ground. Underneath, she wore a simple green t-shirt. Nothing special. Nothing that identified her as military or civilian. But then, she did something that made everyone lean forward. She carefully rolled up her left sleeve. Not quickly, not dramatically, just methodically. Like she was revealing something sacred. And there it was, on her left bicep, a tattoo unlike anything most of them had ever seen. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. It looked like it had been burned, scarred, damaged by fire and heat. The image was barely recognizable, a combat dagger piercing through a torn American flag. Below it, in military stencil font, D-17, Delta 17. The crowd went silent. You could hear the wind moving through the trees. You could hear someone's radio crackling in the distance. You could hear hearts beating faster. Lieutenant Stevens stared at the tattoo. Wait, to 17? That's not a real unit designation. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice dropped to a whisper. No, that's the unit they lost in Lang Sector. The fire, all burned, classified operation. Master Sergeant Jackson felt his stomach drop. He'd heard stories, whispers in the NCO club after too many beers, about a logistics unit that had been overrun, about soldiers who died defending a supply depot that officially never existed. An older voice cut through the silence. Colonel Patricia Hayes stepped out from the observation area. 28 years of service. She'd been watching the confrontation from a distance. That ink, she said slowly, her eyes fixed on Tessa's arm. There were only 2 people authorized to wear that mark. The crowd pressed closer. The unit commander and the unit medic. Hayes continued. The commander died in the Lang Sector incident, 2018. Posthumous Bronze Star. She looked directly at Tessa. That means you're... Tessa met her gaze. Her voice was quiet, but clear. Staff Sergeant Tessa Morin. Delta 17 medical support. Presumed killed in action. March 15th, 2018. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Stevens stammered. But the report said everyone died. The entire unit was lost. Tessa's voice remained steady. I didn't disappear. I stayed quiet. Because no one wanted to remember what we had to do out there. She looked around at the faces staring at her. Young faces. Faces that had never seen real combat. Faces that had never had to make the choices she'd made. That tattoo, she continued, was given to us before our final mission. A mark of commitment to the unit, to each other, to the mission. Her voice got quieter. 7 of us went in. Only I came out. The silence stretched on. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew how to respond to a ghost who just revealed herself. Colonel Hayes stepped forward. Sergeant Morin, why didn't you report in? Why didn't you reclaim your service record? Tessa looked down at her tattoo, at the scorched ink that had survived fire and pain and years of silence. Because those who didn't make it, they wore the same mark. I didn't need a parade to remember them. I just needed to keep serving. CTA Act 2. Comment, the fire didn't erase her, it etched her. Colonel Hayes called for the crowd to disperse, but word was already spreading through the base. Social media posts were going up. Messages were being sent. By evening, everyone knew the name Tessa Morin. And slowly, the real story of Delta 17 began to emerge. It had been a classified logistics operation in the Lang Sector, a forward supply depot supporting special operations teams operating in hostile territory. 7 soldiers, isolated, cut off from regular communication, responsible for maintaining weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment for units that didn't officially exist. The attack came at dawn on March 15, 2018. Intelligence failure, security breach. Someone had given up their location. 47 enemy fighters, rockets, mortars, small arms fire from 3 directions. The depot was designed to be abandoned quickly if overrun. Standard protocol was to destroy sensitive materials and evacuate. But there were wounded soldiers inside, men and women who'd been brought in during the night. Soldiers who couldn't be moved. Tessa was the unit medic, Staff Sergeant Morin, 29 years old, 5 years of service. She made a choice. While the rest of her team prepared the evacuation, she stayed with the wounded, kept them alive, kept them stable. The enemy overran the perimeter. Tessa's commanding officer, Captain David Kim, was killed defending the main building. 6 soldiers died in the first 15 minutes. Tessa was alone, with 7 wounded soldiers who couldn't walk, who couldn't fight, who would die if she left them. For 3 hours, she held the medical facility, using whatever weapons she could find, moving from window to window, keeping the enemy at bay. When she ran out of ammunition, she made another choice. The fuel depot was adjacent to the medical facility. Thousands of gallons of aviation fuel, enough to level the entire compound. Tessa rigged an improvised explosive device, set a timer. loaded the wounded soldiers into the one remaining vehicle. She had 2 minutes to get them to the extraction point. The explosion was visible from 15 miles away. Official reports stated that all personnel were killed in the blast. The enemy was routed. The mission was classified, but Tessa had survived. Severe burns on her left arm and back, temporary hearing loss, smoke inhalation that damaged her vocal cords for months. She was evacuated to a field hospital under an assumed name. The medical staff thought she was a local contractor who'd been caught in the blast. By the time her identity was sorted out, the Delta 17 incident had been sealed, classified, filed away in archives that most people would never access. Her commanding officers offered her options: full disability retirement, medical discharge with honors, a new assignment with her record cleared. She chose none of them. "I want to stay," she told the review board, "but not as Staff Sergeant Morin. That person died with her unit." They offered her a logistics position, no rank, no official record, just a job that would let her serve without recognition. She took it. For 7 years, she'd worked quietly, processing supply requests, managing inventory, keeping the machine running. Nobody asked about her background. Nobody questioned her authority. She was just there. Until a Saturday morning when some young soldiers decided to make an issue of her jacket. Lieutenant Stevens found her that evening, in the logistics warehouse, still working. "Sergeant, ma'am, I owe you an apology." Tessa looked up from her inventory sheet. "No, you don't. You were doing your job. But I accused you of wearing a uniform you thought I hadn't earned." She set down her clipboard. "You were right to question it. That's what good soldiers do." Stevens struggled with his words. "But you saved those soldiers. You're a hero." Tessa's voice was firm. "No. I'm a survivor. There's a difference." She pointed to her tattoo. "Heroes don't come home alone." The next morning, there was a small placard on Tessa's desk. "Delta doesn't forget. And now neither do we." The logistics section was quietly renamed. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a small sign by the door. "Morin Unit, in honor of those who serve in silence. CTA Act 3. Comment: she didn't ask for credit, just to be left in peace." In the weeks that followed, everything changed. And nothing changed. Tessa continued her work in logistics. Same hours, same tasks, same quiet efficiency. But now when she walked through the base, people noticed her differently. Not as the quiet civilian contractor. Not as the woman in the surplus jacket. As Staff Sergeant Tessa Morin, Delta 17, survivor. She never wore the military jacket again in public. But her left sleeve, the one that revealed her scarred tattoo, was always rolled up when she worked. A reminder, not of her service, but of those who didn't come home. Private First Class Maria Santos was new to the base, 18 years old. First assignment out of basic training. She found Tessa in the warehouse one afternoon, organizing medical supplies. "Ma'am," Santos said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" Tessa looked up. "What's on your mind?" "The fire in Lang Sector. Was it really as bad as they say?" Tessa was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "But it wasn't the flames that stayed with me," she said softly. "It was the silence after." Santos didn't understand. The silence. When you lose people, really lose them, the world gets quieter. Their voices are gone. Their laughter is gone. The things they would have said, the jokes they would have made, all gone. Tessa touched her tattoo. "This ink is burned, damaged, but it's still here, like their memory." "Do you regret it? Staying quiet all these years?" Tessa considered the question. "I regret that it took someone questioning my right to wear a jacket for their story to be told. They deserved better than my silence." A month later, a small memorial was erected near the base chapel. 7 names, 7 faces, 7 soldiers who died in an operation that officially never happened. At the bottom, a simple inscription: "They served in silence. They died with honor." They are remembered. Tessa attended the dedication ceremony. She stood in the back, said nothing. But when the names were read aloud, when Captain David Kim's name was called, she saluted. A proper military salute. Sharp, precise, respectful. The salute she'd been waiting 7 years to give. After the ceremony, Colonel Hayes approached her. "Sergeant Morin, would you consider returning to active duty with full rank restoration?" Tessa shook her head. "I'm exactly where I need to be, ma'am." She looked at the memorial. Someone needs to remember them. Someone needs to keep their story alive. And someone needs to make sure the supplies keep flowing, without recognition, without fanfare. Hayes understood. Just like Delta 17. Just like Delta 17. CTA Act 4. Comment, she didn't need to wear a rank. She wore memory. Some people serve without applause. Some burn and choose not to be seen again. But sometimes, the scars they carry speak louder than any uniform or rank. Tessa Morin didn't need medals. She didn't need parades. She didn't need her name on a plaque or her story in a history book. She just needed her silence to mean something. And when the time came, when her right to serve was questioned, she didn't argue. She didn't shout. She didn't demand recognition. She just rolled up her sleeve. Because some truths don't need words. Some stories don't need telling. Some heroes don't need recognition. They just need to be left alone to do what heroes do. Serve, protect, remember. The young soldiers who questioned her that day learned something more valuable than military regulations. They learned that heroism doesn't always wear the right uniform. That service doesn't always come with the right paperwork. That sometimes the most important people are the ones you never notice until you need them. Tessa's tattoo told a story that 7 years of silence couldn't erase. A story of sacrifice, of loss, of choosing to carry the weight of memory rather than the glory of survival. In a world that demands recognition for every act of service, she chose invisibility. In a culture that celebrates individual achievement, she chose collective memory. She wore her scar not as badges of honor, but as promises kept. Promises to soldiers who would never come home. Promises that their sacrifice would never be forgotten, even if their story was never told. Final CTA. Comment, the tattoo said everything. If this story stayed with you.